there is so much that we are still learning. There are probably a million pieces to a puzzle, and I love doing puzzles. And with the Underground Railroad, there are so many moving parts and different pieces. And I find that this is such an exciting topic because we are still finding new things and making new connections. There's a lot of information out there. And I will also confess that this particular book actually had to get cut down. I think I cut down at least 10,000 words or more. And so what you're getting in the book is just a small slither of a much larger story. And I was so struck by the fact that that there were no books that had been done on the Underground Railroad in Virginia. And so I'm happy to be able to give you just a little taste of what I found. And I always like to start with this map. And that's because this map really provides us with a sense of the vastness of the waterways systems. And I remember back in, I think it was 2003 or 2005, we hosted at Norfolk State University a number of historians, including Dan Sayers, who had just discovered information about the Maroon communities in the Dismal Swamp. And this was before he actually discovered about 20 different communities. But he had, I think, discovered his first site at that point. And we also have Fergus Bordewich, who he's a journalist who did this amazing book on the Underground Railroad. But I asked him, why didn't you have a whole chapter on Virginia? There were more enslaved people who left Virginia than any place else, in part because Virginia was the largest state in the nation in terms of population. And it had more enslaved people and more free blacks, well, with the exception of Maryland, which in the 1840s had about 10,000 more free blacks than Virginia. But that was because the Nat Turner Revolt triggered the departure of so many free blacks, going not just to Liberia, which is the typical place that people think about, but they went into Pennsylvania and New York and other places. But why didn't you look at Virginia? And by the end of our 2-day conference, he said, you know what, had I been to this conference before I wrote the book, my discussion would have been completely different, because I underestimated the importance of the waterways. In fact, William Still, who was the station master in Philadelphia of the Underground Railroad, he was also the secretary of the Vigilance Committee. He said that Norfolk, the port of Norfolk, which at that time was the port of Virginia and was designated as that as far back as 1680, he said that Norfolk was the southern depot of the Underground Railroad. And you can see Norfolk down in the lower right-hand side of your screen. That's also, you can also see where the Dismal Swamp is. And today, if you visit the Dismal Swamp, it's probably only about 1/8 of the size that it originally was. And I always remind people, now is the time, if you're going to go to the Dismal Swamp, now is the time to come. Do not come when it hits May, June, July, August, September, or October now, because that's where you get the biting flies, the chiggers, the ticks, the fleas, all kinds of animals that require DDT to kill them if they get on your clothing. But come when the weather is cooler and you just get a little bit of a sense of that landscape and how it was a foreboding landscape for most people. This is the landscape that George Washington had planned to build a whole bunch of farms. And you can see some of the farms that were built in that area. The reason why it's only an eighth of the size is because of the lumbering industry. So the cedar trees were big, and of course, so much of that timber was exported in Norfolk. And of course, we would see the building, the construction of all of these canals, which one of them became the Intercoastal Highway. And that particular, the canals that were built became avenues for escape, not just for people working those canals. Some people used it to live within the swamp, and some people used it to depart from the swamp. We would see the same kinds of things happening throughout Virginia. Look at these waterways. The James River, for example, as it goes into from the Chesapeake Bay, and it goes all the way to the western part of the state. And you look at the Rappahannock, which of course, that's where Fauquier County is, you know, right there. And then the Potomac River. And these are major waterways. And these waterways would take you quickly, easily to places like Philadelphia, to New Bedford, Massachusetts, to Boston, Massachusetts, eventually to Syracuse, although many people actually travel to Syracuse via trains. And so I want people to see these waterways, because if you look from one side on the peninsula to the other on the eastern shore, if it's somewhat foggy, you cannot see the landscape on the other side. That's how vast it is. And the primary people who were utilizing the waterways, who were the watermen, who worked the ferries and the steamships and the schooners, were African American men. Many of them were enslaved. In fact, Virginia was so concerned about this that around the 1820s, they tried to limit the number of Blacks who were working in the maritime industry. But because they dominated the industry and people were making money with their work, there was a resistance to pulling back and to hiring free labor. And so African Americans knew the waterways. And this is what helped to open the door for many people to escape. And so what I saw when I was looking at this huge landscape that we call Virginia, I saw so many people escaping by water, not by foot. In fact, the myth is that people escape primarily on foot. And you know, you have Harriet Tubman as an example. But if people actually look at the story of Harriet Tubman, they will see, and I was so glad it was depicted in the film, half the time when she was helping people escape, they were using the waterways. So the waterways were the highways, and they were the quicker way to get to your destination, because traveling on foot was so dangerous. And so I also always let people know that escaping was not an easy thing to do. It was also not a choice that many people selected, in part because it meant separating yourself from your family, maybe forever. It meant that if you got caught, you were punished severely, or worse yet, your family was punished severely. You were perhaps sold to the lower South. Virginia's primary industry was not tobacco, it was human trafficking by the 19th century. And so there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who were forced to leave their families and their homes, and they were sent to the lower South. Many of them, of course, ending up in Louisiana, Mississippi, as well as East Texas. And this is all by the 1840s and 50s, so much so that the South, and in particular America, produced 7/8 of the world's cotton production by 1860. 7/8 of the world's cotton production by 1860. Of course, Virginia's second largest industry was tobacco production. And there were farms, and of course, I always differentiate the farm from the plantation, because the plantation usually had a minimum of 20 people who were enslaved on that plantation. Farms may have only had 2 or 3 or 5. And we had the further south you went in Virginia, in my area of Hampton Roads, which had smaller farms, even though they still call them plantations. Southampton County, for example, typically had a farm as opposed to a plantation. And it's because the soil was so sandy that you just did not have the cotton production in the size that you had as you went further into the Piedmont region of Virginia. So the Tidewater region was low-lying. In fact, in most of Tidewater, you're at or below sea level. That's why Norfolk is sinking, because most of Norfolk is actually at or below sea level. And most of the journey around Tidewater is very flat, and you have lots and lots and lots of rivers, creeks, streams, and people utilize all of that as a way of escaping. The same thing you would see in Southampton County. Say you're going to Franklin, Virginia, down Route 58 all the way to Emporia. Lots of rivers, lots of streams, lots of creeks. And that's how people escaped. And where were they trying to go? In Hampton Roads, they were trying to get to the Norfolk port. In the Richmond area, Chesterfield County, all of that, they were trying to get to Richmond. Fauquier County, they were trying to get to Alexandria. So there were certain hubs where they were trying to get to so that they could get aboard a ship. But many people who did escape, and comparatively speaking, there weren't that many. There are estimates of about 100,000 people who escaped. There may have been more, there may have been less. We don't really know. But the estimates are about 100,000. Most of them who escaped because they didn't have a choice. They were like Henry Box Brown, and I put that quote around it, who did what a lot of people did, and that is he had someone nail him in a box, and he had a little device so that he could carve out air holes in that box, because there were people who made that attempt to mail themselves to the North, and when they arrived, they were dead because they had suffocated to death. And so Henry Brown escaped in this very dramatic way because he had tried 3 times to purchase the freedom of his wife, and his owner and an attorney swindled him out of his money 3 times. And he was in the process of trying to raise money for a 4th time when her owner sold her away. And he was so despondent that he contemplated suicide, and eventually decided he was going to involve himself in such a creative scheme of getting to freedom that he had himself nailed in a box. And he spent the rest of his life trying to find his wife and never did. And so that separation was a motivation. Being treated harshly was also a motivation. In fact, there were some people, you think of Frederick Douglass, deciding that he was going to escape because he had had enough. He wasn't going to get beaten anymore. And he actually beat a man who rented him out, beat him to a pulp, and he was afraid that he was going to get sold away. And after that, he decided that he didn't care anymore. He was going to get his freedom. Some people were connected with the Underground Railroad. We had a man named Sam Nixon in Norfolk who was a slave to a dentist by the name of Martin. And Dr. Martin would send him out on home visits at night to tend to people. And so Sam Nixon got involved with the Underground Railroad. He became a huge conductor on the Underground Railroad. And after a while, people began to suspect that he was involved. How was he able to be involved? Because he had a pass. And everyone knew that if they saw him out there, the doctor probably sent him out to take care of a patient. But word started leaking out, because I'm sure there were a few times when he was out and the dentist had not sent him out to take care of somebody. So word got out that he may be involved in the Underground Railroad, and he secured his own passage aboard one of the steamships and made his way eventually through Philadelphia to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And that's where he settled and eventually joined the 54th Massachusetts Regiment in 1863, and then returned to Norfolk, having completed his dental training, and set up his office as a dentist in Norfolk, and then served in the Constitutional Convention in Virginia in 1867-68. So he was someone who never stopped pushing and never stopped advocating for himself and for other African Americans. But he was involved with the Underground Railroad. And some people wanted a better life. They were completely dissatisfied and decided that they would rather be dead than to be a slave. And then finally, the death of a slaveholder always meant that you would be, or your family members would be, sold away. And I would see this time and time and time again in all of these different accounts that I would look at. And so those were the motivations. But I wanted you also to kind of see the census records, how America decided after the American Revolution that they wanted slavery. That they not only wanted slavery, but they wanted slavery big time. That they started sending ships to Cuba and to the west coast of Africa. And there were more people who were enslaved, who were brought into this country between 1783 and 1806 than all the years prior to that time. So imagine, we went from 1619 to 1782, but there were more people brought into this country who were enslaved from 1783 to 1806 than all those years prior to that time. And so we would see this significant increase in the numbers of enslaved people, and most of them coming into Virginia, although you had a lot of them also coming into the Carolinas. There were a number coming into Pennsylvania, because there's this myth that the North didn't have slavery. Yes, the North did have slavery. And of course, it wasn't until the 1780s, 90s, and into the 1800s that northern states began to gradually eliminate slavery, because they decided that they did not want a huge population of people of African descent in the North. They would rather have a majority white population, whereas the southern states continued, their populations of African Americans continued to grow. We would see, for example, South Carolina having a 60% Black population in the antebellum period, the colonial and antebellum period. Virginia would hover between 30 and 40%. And so we see these figures. You can look at the numbers of percentage, of course, as we're going into Georgia, and then it getting less and less as we go north. But imagine, you still had enslaved people in northern states in the 1790 census. Still had enslaved people. In 1830, look at the census. You have fewer, of course, enslaved people in the northern areas, but still a few. And even in the area around the Great Lakes, we had the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that banned slavery in that territory, that even banned free blacks moving into that territory unless they put a bounty up guaranteeing their good behavior. And yet you still saw enslaved people in the old Northwest Territory, what we call the Great Lakes region. But of course, you're seeing American society moving westward all along the Mississippi River, and of course, the area on the left side of the Mississippi River, East Texas, you're starting to see huge numbers being brought into that area, and of course, growing in size and in volume. And yet, and still, Virginia, having still the majority of enslaved people there, although those numbers were starting to get overwhelmed by the numbers that you see all along the Mississippi River. Now, what was fueling a lot of this by the time we got to the 19th century? Of course, we know it was cotton. Cotton was king, and cotton was our driving industry in America. In fact, historians have looked at all of the industries that America had at this time, but the biggest industry, the most prosperous industry, was the industry of slavery that included not just human trafficking, but also the products that were produced. And when I hear people today making an argument, because Project 1619 had an article that talked about this, and I hear people saying that was not true. You know, I don't know what they're talking about. And my head is about to explode, because clearly they do not live in the world of facts. And the facts are clear about what industries America had. And economists have also looked at this and seen the numbers as well. And cotton was the important industry. But what most people don't realize is that the main consumer of that cotton, aside from those in America, the main consumer was Great Britain. And Britain, of course, took that cotton. Most southern states sent their cotton to Great Britain, and they disseminated it. They resold it to the rest of the world, which is why Britain was kind of playing both sides during our Civil War. They provided a lot of support to the Confederacy while saying they were anti-slavery. But of course, we know that countries really don't have any ethics and morals. They have money as their primary goal and power. Now, I wanted to kind of pull us to Fauquier County and look at how that region, because the Piedmont region is where the vast majority of the tobacco plantations were located. You may have had a few who were producing cotton, but most were not. Most were producing tobacco, and that was king in Virginia. And as you can see with Hanover and Culpeper, they had huge numbers, but of course higher than that, you had Essex and you had Amelia counties with the largest concentrations. But then when you look at Fauquier County, even though that was the lowest, it was still pretty high in terms of production. So high that the population in Fauquier County of African Americans ended up being close to 50%. Now, I want to mention, with this high census, you also had something else. And I just pulled a few documents that are available online, just to kind of tell you there were a lot of things going on. And I know that the mythology is that, you know, all Black people were happy and passive and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, no, that was not true. There were a number of people you will find in the records and this is just snipping out 1816 to 1842. And I just stopped with the bees, and there were 201 and counting, and that was on page 4 out of page 11, of how many people were on that list between this time. And you had, I just pulled out randomly 5 individuals from Fauquier County who had been on this condemned list. Now, none of these people were actually executed. Instead, they were sold to the lower South. And I wanted you to see this, to just get a sense of, there were not only slaveholders who were selling their enslaved people because it was very prosperous to sell them instead of having them work on the tobacco plantation, but some of these people who were troublesome slaves, they refused to do certain things. In some cases, these young men were sold because of a reaction that was happening with their families, because we know that there was quite a bit of rape of women during this time. And so we don't know all the details of why these individuals were condemned, but we do know that it involved some kind of reaction, some kind of physical or violent reaction that was going on. Now, keep in mind, Virginia had passed a law in 1667 allowing for the, quote, casual killing of Black people if they resisted by their owners. And then 4 years later, they passed a law allowing any white person to casually kill a Black person. And all these people who were condemned, the owner did not take a hit for that. Once they were condemned by the courts, the state actually rewarded owners with the value of their slaves. So they paid them for these individuals. So there was a lot of state support for this particular, for slavery. And I just wanted you to, as I said, just see. Now, most of these people were, in their 20s and 30s, but you see a couple of people who were kind of long in the tooth at that time, 43 and 47 years old, who were condemned. And so I also wanted you to see the statistics that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, that in Fauquier County, about 50%, and this is, I believe, looking at 1860, 50% of the county was made up of not just enslaved people. The majority of Blacks in Fauquier County were enslaved. You did have a few free Blacks there, but 50% of the population were African Americans. And you look at the total in Virginia, 31% at this time, 50% in that county. So what was happening in that county? Well, one of the things, of course, we would see are what I call freedom seekers. And in my book, I decided to tell the story of the Underground Railroad through a longer arc, that this idea of running away, of being a fugitive, is not new. What was different with the Underground Railroad period, officially beginning in 1830, versus what happened earlier, had to do with kind of a system that was put in place, or a practice that was put in place, where there were people of goodwill who decided that they were going to risk their lives and fight against slavery secretly. And they had to do it secretly because it was against the law to help an enslaved person escape. It was a federal violation, not just a state violation, because there was only one industry that the American government said it would protect, and that is slavery. They would protect the rights of slaveholders. How do we know that? because there was a fugitive slave clause put in the original Constitution that empowered the federal government to protect and defend the rights of slaveholders and of the institution of slavery. All the other rights that you had as a landowner was protected by the states. The one right that was guaranteed to be protected by the federal government was your right as a slaveholder. And so slavery was big business, and that's why you had a lot of people who were bounty hunters, and they went out, and in fact you had a lot of constables. In fact, Norfolk had a constable who was so notorious that Harriet Beecher Stowe based one of her slave hunter characters off of this guy named Capehart, who helped to capture George Latimer, who was the father of Lewis Latimer, the famous inventor. And George and his wife Rebecca escaped from Norfolk in 1842, found their way up in Boston, where he was captured by this constable who was busy slave catching in Boston, even though he was a constable in Norfolk. And so people would put these rewards. Now, one of the things we would see earlier about these rewards is that earlier prior to the 1830s, most of the people who escaped did not escape farther than maybe 50 to 100 miles from where they were from. But afterwards, they would actually go from the south to the north, or they would actually go to Canada. And you would start to see individuals, as I said, helping them to escape. We would also see something else, which I highlighted in red, and that is a lot of African Americans being hired who were enslaved. And this created a lot of problems for law enforcement. And in fact, law enforcement in the South was really all about maintaining and protecting slavery. And that's why you still have some of the issues that you have today about violence against African Americans, because that was the focus. It was on maintaining and protecting the interests of slaveholders. You would see even earlier examples of people where they would describe what they had on, what they looked like, all kinds of details. But later on, you wouldn't see all of those details. And it's because the people were leaving from one location, one region, one state, and going to a completely different state. And more than likely, they had changed clothing. And so we would see this shift from the earlier freedom seekers to those in the 19th century. We would see these big posters after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act that empowered people who were bounty hunters not only to seize an individual wherever they were, but also it empowered the interests of slaveholders to have a special court that would reward the judge for finding that individual to be a fugitive slave. And what was really bad, the reason why you had some states like Massachusetts pass liberty laws and so forth, is because they, no African American could defend themselves in court against a white person. Their testimony could only be entered if it was against another Black person. And so they were deprived of the right to defend themselves in court if the person who was accusing them was white. And so that's why you had such a big fight by the time you got to 1850. And at that point, the lines of division were clear. Now, I also wanted to give you an example of what we would find in Fauquier County. And this is in 1850, where this man named Richard, they offered $150. Now, imagine how much $150 was in 1850. you're talking about probably about $1,000 today. And this individual, they describe him. They say that, you know, if he was taken out, you know, then they want him brought back. They estimated his age. Now, why would an owner not know the age of the slave? So that suggests a lot of things. That suggests that this person is from a larger plantation, that he's probably not that well known by the owner. And because you've got very vague descriptions of this individual, 5, 10, 11, that's not too vague, but you know, how do you find a person who has considerable personal strength? How would you be able to point that out? And so then it becomes a very amorphous descriptions. Again, because these people are probably coming from larger plantations. Now, I wanted to show you this map, and I like the overlay because people who were leaving from Fauquier and Loudoun County and Prince William, of course, many of them were headed straight up towards Philadelphia. And part of the reason is because by the latter part of the 18th and early part of 19th century, large numbers of Quakers moved into Virginia with this idea that they wanted to, because they had been impacted by the Great Awakening. And many Quakers became very strong advocates against slavery. And they wanted to influence Virginia. And so many of them were right there on the border of Virginia, or right where there were the borders of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. And so many people were headed in that direction on their way up to Philadelphia. But also you would start to see by the 1830s, communities of free Blacks. For example, in Oxford, Pennsylvania, where Lincoln University is located today, you have the Hosanna Church there, which was a hotbed of abolitionism. That community was made up of free Blacks who mostly came from Virginia, but some came from Maryland, and they started that community, and it became a very strong, active abolitionist community. And a lot of accounts today ignore the role of free Blacks as abolitionists who worked in the Underground Railroad. And I was also happy that the film Harriet depicted for the first time William Still. This is a picture of him, and the reason that he began to collect these stories, he had been working for a few years, but the reason he began to collect the stories was because one young man that he interviewed was from where his family was located, where his parents escaped. And then as he talked more and more and more, he found out that this was his older, long-lost brother, who had been sold away before his parents escaped. William Still had been born in a free territory after his parents had escaped. But that's what motivated him to begin to write down the stories of the people who passed through his station. And there were 763 people who passed through his station. And 285 came from Virginia, 350 from Maryland, and then the numbers were smaller and smaller. And of course, the reason that he got so many is because of the proximity of Philadelphia to Maryland. But he didn't talk about all of those who went straight to Boston, those who went straight to New Bedford, Massachusetts, or went to Syracuse. He was just talking about those who went through his station. But fortunately, he was a pack rat, and he kept all of his records, unlike the other station managers who burned their records during the Civil War. Because they were fearful that someone would retaliate against those individuals who had escaped. And where did a lot of the activities in Philadelphia happen? In that little building right in the center of these two buildings, the African Czar Methodist Church, and that's where a lot of people arrived. They were directed to go to this church or to the office of William Still. And so, you know, I wanted to kind of point so that you see that the areas of Boston and New Bedford, these were areas where people would arrive by schooners or by steamships. Most of the people who got on a schooner went to New Bedford. And New Bedford was a very interesting little town, if you've ever been to New Bedford, or little city, I should say. The people of the whites in New Bedford were not necessarily pro or anti-slavery, but they hated outsiders coming in. And once you became a member of their community, and somebody tried to snatch you out, the entire community rose up to protect you. So New Bedford was a very interesting place, and the reason that the 54th Massachusetts Regiment was mustered in New Bedford is because it was filled with so many freedom seekers and their children. And so either freedom seekers or their children enlisted in New Bedford in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, because they had already shown themselves to be kind of a different sort of person, taking risks that perhaps others didn't take. And I wanted you to see some of these steamships. Now, of course, many captains aboard these steamships didn't know that people were being hidden aboard the ships. And usually the secret compartments were right there by the boiler. So if you can imagine a 3-day journey in the summer over a boiler, what you would experience with that journey. And many thought they were going to die. And these particular ships were utilized all the time in Virginia by stewards who would work on these ships, like John Minkins, who was a free black from Norfolk, who was cited many times by William Still as helping hundreds of people escape. Eventually, he became a schooner captain. You would have some people, like in this story of Robert Emerson, and I said that he was the brother of Jeffrey Wilson. Jeffrey Wilson was a man who remained in Portsmouth. These were all people from Portsmouth, Virginia. And Jeffrey Wilson started the first column for African Americans in a white newspaper, the Portsmouth Star, called the Colored Notes. He even talked about the Underground Railroad. And interestingly, his brother, Robert, would eventually go to Canada, then after the war, moved to San Francisco, where he worked for William Randolph Hearst in his newspaper. But these individuals managed to get aboard a skiff right there at the Hampton Roads, which is that waterway between Norfolk and Hampton. It's a very deep water area. It's very rough, as you can see with the seas. You have to be kind of crazy to be out there on a little skiff in this kind of water. It was extremely dangerous. And they were able to get aboard a ship past the inspection station, because that was important. People would stop these ships. The Virginia port would stop the ships before they would leave the area, checking for enslaved people. Sometimes they would find them, and sometimes they wouldn't. And I wanted to show you this picture of a man. His name was Alfred Fountain. He was known by William Still as Captain F. He's the one wielding the axe. And this actually took place at Waterside in Norfolk, in downtown Norfolk, where he had 23 people hidden in a secret compartment aboard his ship. And the mayor of the city and city council people and some guys who were pretty much ruffians, they went aboard the ship, and they were going to tear the ship apart to find these enslaved people. And when he started hacking away, they figured, you know, okay, well, he must not have any enslaved people, but some were not convinced. So they sent word to Philadelphia to check out the ship, which is why he didn't go directly to Philadelphia. Some of the people were let off at Teague Island, and they of course were taken by carriage into the city and then sent to northern or areas or to Canada, with most going to Toronto, by the way. I mentioned the Dismal Swamp. If you ever have a chance to go, you must drive to the Dismal Swamp, and drive also, if you're in the Chesapeake, Suffolk side, drive to Lake Drummond. Lake Drummond is where you had a lot of, you had one maroon community. If you go there, you must take Longfellow's poem about the maroon and read it after you've been there, because that's a place that is unreal. You hear no birds, you hear no insects, you hear nothing in that as you're right there by the lake. It is a freshwater lake. It's not more than 7 or 8 feet deep. It's filled with tannic acid, so there are no fish in that lake, which is why it's like a death. And if you can imagine, you're going to live in this very vacant, almost death-filled region just to be free. And so it's a interesting place to visit. But there were a number of people who used, and I want to show you this particular boat, and also to show you a picture of Azaman, who was probably from what today is Nigeria. These individuals were the Maroons living in the swamp. So they were not trying to get out of the area. They were actually living there. Some of them lived and died there. Some of them were born there. In fact, a few people who were actually captured, who had children, the children never spoke above a whisper. And it's because, of course, the sound would carry, and this is what the parents did to ensure their protection. When you go to the western part of the state and you're there at the Kanawha Canal, you see a different kind of environment than in the Tidewater area, where you do have the canals. You have the smaller branches of the James River especially, but people are still utilizing these waterways and as important departure points, and they would go all the way to near the borders of the Virginia and Pennsylvania line. And you would see the same thing happen in Ohio. In fact, these kinds of situations, this particular drawing of enslaved people making it across one of the rivers and abolitionists waiting to take them to safety, was very, very common. Not always with whites, most of the time it's with blacks, but they would carry them over to freedom and to safety. Now I know I'm just about out of time, and I wanted to just mention a couple of stories. One is 1857, and you may have heard this story with Barnaby Grigby and his wife, Mary Elizabeth, Frank Wanzer, and who called his owner the meanest man in Virginia, Emily Foster, and then 2 others who were not named. And from what I've been able to find, Frank Wanzer was from Fauquier County, and one of the 2 not named was also from Fauquier County, and one was killed, the other was captured and put in jail and probably sent to the lower South. But I wanted to give you some excerpts, and I don't usually do this, but I wanted to read you what William Still said. He said that all these persons journeyed together from Loudon and Fauquier, Virginia, on horseback and in a carriage for more than 100 miles. availing themselves of a holiday, and he's being sarcastic here, availing themselves of a holiday and their master's horses and carriage, they as deliberately started for Canada, as though they had never been taught that it was their duty as servants to obey their masters. In this particular showing, a most utter disregard of the interests of their, quote, kind-hearted and indulgent owners. They left home on Monday, Christmas Eve, 1855, under the leadership of Frank Wanzer, and arrived in, I misspelled that, Columbia the following Wednesday at 1 o'clock. About 100 miles from home in the neighborhood of Cheat River, Maryland, they were attacked by 6 white men and a boy who demanded an account of themselves, believing they were fugitives. At this juncture, the fugitives, verily believing that the time had arrived for the practical use of their pistols and dirks, pulled them out of their concealment, the young women as well as young men, and declared they would not be taken. One of the white men raised his gun, pointing the muzzle directly towards one of the young women with a threat that he would shoot, etc. "Shoot, shoot, shoot," she exclaimed, with a double-barreled pistol in one hand and a long dirk knife in the other, utterly unterrified and fully ready for a death struggle. The adversaries, seeing the weapons and the unflinching determination on the part of the runaways to stand their ground, spill blood, kill or die, rather than be taken, very prudently sidled over to the other side of the road, leaving at least 4 of the victors to travel on their way. And this is the picture that William Still drew as he heard this story. And I would say that if a woman is pointing a gun at you and threatening to kill you, she will kill you. Men are the ones who will threaten. Women will kill you. And so I am pretty sure that that is exactly why they backed off. And you see this group of people who were ready. Now, where they got the guns, they probably got them from their owners. They were willing to use them. And as I said, the 2 men who were on horseback were captured. Those on the wagon got away. And from what I've been able to find, the Wanzer married, and then the Grigbys, they all ended up in Canada, in Toronto, and actually had houses side by side. And from what I could gather, lived the rest of their lives there. And there was another person named William Robinson, also included in William Still's account, where, it describes him, and they said he fled from his owner, John Beale. A few days before William left, the overseer on the plantation attempted to flog him, but didn't succeed. William's manhood was aroused, and he flogged the overseer soundly, if what he averred was true. And this is William Still's commentary. The name of William's owner was John G. Beale, Esquire, who was considered to be a man of wealth, had invested in slave stock to the number of 70. And according to William's account, he was a hard man and thought no more of his black people than he did of dogs. Robinson left, and William Still didn't explain how he escaped, just that he escaped with a $1.25 in his pocket, and he reached Philadelphia, and from there he went to Canada. And then another person, 1854, James Stewart, also from Fauquier County, fled from his owner. And what was interesting about this particular account is it doesn't give us any details. What it focuses on more than anything else is his desire to be free, and how this man somehow was born hating slavery and determined at some point to be free. And as soon as he turned 21, he made his escape and gained his freedom. Now, one of the people in your region, and I'm assuming that some of you may know Eugene Shield, did an interesting map on the Underground Railroad, which I really would like to see a lot more research done on this particular topic, because I think that these kinds of projects will help us to uncover who some of the people were who assisted individuals in their flight to freedom. So I wanted to just mention that. And I also wanted to show you this map of the Ontario province of Canada. And of course, Toronto is the primary center. There were more freedom seekers who settled in Canada because of the job opportunities than in other places, even though they face a lot of bigotry and prejudice and so forth. But a number of people settled in places like St. Catharines. That's where Harriet Tubman had a home. They also settled in Hamilton and Kingston. So they had small communities, Buxton, Amherstburg. And so there are abolitionists who did some accounts of those individuals. And on the Canadian side, there are a number of historians who have been tracking who some of the families were. Some of them actually moved to Detroit after the end of the Civil War and settled in Detroit and in a few other areas, Chicago, in the Great Lakes region after the Civil War, and continue to live there or have moved to other places but know that side of their history. But I'm going to stop right there and see if there are any questions for me.
Yeah, guys, so if you have a question, you can write it in the chat. You can come on to, you can take yourself off mute, or you can raise your hand in video. I know I have a ton of questions, so if we don't get any, that's totally okay. I will obviously be asking quite a few because I've got many, but please, guys, if you have any questions, this is your chance. You can come forward, come off mute, you can write in chat, and we'll give you a little bit of time to do that right now.
And I do apologize for running my mouth too much.
No, that was great. Honestly, I didn't want you to stop because you had so much good stuff in those stories. I'm really glad we got to that at the end. So just awesome. Okay, let's see if there's anybody that has a question. And if not, I'll ask a couple and then maybe you guys will get some, but let's see, give a little bit of time for you guys to come forward. Oh, okay. So from Ulysses, not a question, but this is a great lecture. So thank you, Ulysses. I agree. It was amazing so far. Thank you for that input. Well, I'll go ahead and ask a question myself. And then if anybody has one, then definitely feel free to come after that. One of the things that I wanted to know that really struck out to me and that has when I've looked at this before in the past is that it seems that demographically, it's more men than women who are often achieving their freedom when they freedom seek. Do we know why is there a reason for that? Is it because women who have children are less likely to want to flee because it's harder to do that with children and it's much more of a consideration? Can you speak to that?
Yes, in fact, I really looked at I call it, once again, another myth that the overwhelming majority of men are the ones who escaped. And I think we just know a lot more about the men.
Gotcha.
Because often they would name the man and then they would say his wife. So it's like the farmer. And sometimes they would disconnect because a woman would flee with her children, or she would be a part of a group and they would just say a woman and not name her.
Right.
But the majority of men who escaped were not unmarried. Most of them were actually married. They escaped because they were about to be sold, because of course younger men were the first ones who were being sold to the lower South. Many of them, and I'll give you one example, a man by the name of Atkinson who he was working as a steward aboard the City of Richmond steamship. And he was enslaved and he met his wife in Richmond. He was living in Norfolk and he married her. And then after about a year or two, he decided, I'm not going to have a child born in slavery. And so he did not tell his wife he was going to escape. Instead, he took off. And then he got up to Canada and wrote these mournful letters to William Still. He said that he couldn't live without her, that he wrote in one of his letters, if I can just gaze upon her sweet lips 1 minute, I would be ready to die the next. I cannot live without my wife. And he worked hard with William Still to secure her passage, which he did, and she joined him in Canada. But you know, that's an example. But the typically, if a person was, and this was before we would really see a system in place by the 1850s, where a lot of ships captains had special passenger containers or sections, secret sections aboard their ships. Before that, it was a helter-skelter approach to escaping, and that's when you would see a lot more men. Afterwards, you would see family groups escaping. And it's at that point, by the time you got around 1854, 1855, you would see these large groups of people escaping. I do want to say that this effort of freedom seeking and the Underground Railroad continued through the Civil War. Most of the time, historians have kind of stopped the discussion by 1860, but there were quite a few. In fact, I want people to see those classified as contrabands as part of the Underground Railroad. They were often escaping as family groups. They were escaping to and created communities outside of, like at Fort Monroe, just outside of the fort, where they would be protected, or they would create a community right beside wherever the soldiers, the Union soldiers, were encamped. And they continue to have this network of communication to help people to find out where they were and to protect themselves. And this is also the time that many were reunited. Family members who have been sold to someone maybe 50 miles away found reconnected with a lot of their family members, but then in some cases never reconnected. But that was still a continuum. We had in Richmond, you had some people, Maggie Walker's mother, for example, who was helping with an Underground Railroad network in that city. So you still had that transpiring. It's just that people aren't seeing it as part of this long continuum.
No, that makes sense. Okay. We have some questions from Laura Collins. I'm curious about Dr. Newby-Alexander's thoughts on how Virginians can support documentation of the Underground Railroad in the Commonwealth. That's a great question.
I think that digitizing all of our records so that they are searchable and you can cross-reference a number of things would be extremely helpful. What would also be helpful is as you're looking at some of the records of people who've escaped, letters that talk about it, that will help us sort of piece this puzzle together, because some people escaped and there's no mention of the owner in the records. You'll see the mention in the accounts, but you don't see, if you look at the census records, that person is not there. Even though that person is probably still there, they just weren't picked up by the census records. But you'll see their names perhaps at a different point in time, maybe by 1870. And so having all those records pulled together, all the newspapers, all of the court records, that would really, really be helpful. I found out about a man named Sheridan Ford who escaped from Portsmouth because I happened upon an article in this magazine that was only published for about 4 years called the Colored American Magazine, saying that there was a big court case, a Supreme Court case involving his descendants. And I looked for the US Supreme Court, didn't see it. Virginia Supreme Court didn't see it. Then found an article that said this was a Massachusetts Supreme Court. And I contacted the court and they said, yeah, we have these records. depositions, you know, what the court,
Wow.
I almost lost my mind because nobody had seen or looked at these depositions since they
Oh,
were taken in 1897. And I found out about this man's life and about who he married after he left, who he was married before. I found out that he had reconnected with his family. I found, in fact, I talked with the family who's living in the house in which this man was enslaved, and they tracked down some of his descendants and have found over 300 of his descendants, many of whom are college professors and
oh,
professionals who knew nothing about this man's life and world. And so I believe that those kinds of records could be so beneficial to us knowing a lot more of these stories.
yeah. What a find. And that, yeah, it shows that there's treasure troves out there that still just need to be discovered. Um, Patrice Alvarado asks, she says, first off, she says, I agree that this was a great lecture. She says, my question is that when you say Virginia had the most enslaved people, was that per capita or the most number of people who came through Virginia, I guess meaning in Virginia?
Oh, I mean, just in terms of sheer
Yeah.
numbers, it was the largest. And you know, Virginia began to drop in population uh, after the Civil War, as people were migrating westward for land and they were migrating northward. Huge numbers. By the 1870s, huge numbers were going to the cities in Virginia, but then going really northward, New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, because they were looking for factory jobs, and a different world, a different lifestyle. You know, they wanted the city world and the excitement of that world. So many were leaving for that reason. The Newport News shipyard started out as the Huntington shipyard. That attracted a number of people, but of course their numbers of who they could actually hire were limited. So you had some people coming from the north starting big factories, but it wasn't enough to really sustain the population. And so they were looking for opportunities elsewhere. And that's when the numbers in Virginia began to drop.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that Virginia had the largest enslaved population in 1860, and I think you mentioned this in the lecture. Despite the fact that we sent tens of thousands of enslaved people to the lower South for
Every year.
years, every year. I mean, it's incredible that it shows just how essential slavery was to Virginia going all the way into 1860. And people forget that. I bring up that Fauquier County was 50% enslaved all the time, and people are shocked. They're like, tobacco wasn't that big of an industry in Fauquier, and I'd say, yeah, slavery and tobacco weren't just the only thing. Yeah, slavery was part of every economic thing.
Of course, Virginia had already reached that, I call it day 99 in the guppy tank. You know, it had already reached a point where each year the population was just going to grow
Right.
exponentially. And that's why it was able to sustain its size, even in the face of tens of thousands every year being exported out.
Right, and that was a powerful thing you said, that that the largest industry in Virginia was human trafficking. I'd known it was one of the largest. I didn't know it was the largest. So that's an unbelievable stat to hear. Okay, so from Sherry Huerta, I'm curious to know more about surveillance against freedom seekers in ports like Norfolk. Slave patrols could assist in identifying people, quote unquote, off the plantation, particularly in rural areas. But was there a patrol system for port towns like Norfolk as a tool for enslavers to prevent mobility or movement of enslaved persons? It's great.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, the constables were a big part of this in the early part of the 19th century. And you would see Virginia passing legislation allowing for the hiring of night watchmen, because the night, of course, was the biggest time that when people would escape, and they would patrol the docks at night. And there was one enslaved woman named Clarissa Davis who escaped in 1855, who talked about how she was supposed to meet her two brothers who escaped aboard a schooner. And for whatever reason, she missed it. And so she wasn't going to go back to her owners. And she hung out in what she said was a miserable coop for 75 days. And then it was one night when two conductors, interestingly, well, actually, one conductor who was a white man, who was a very prominent white man, according to her, he was married to a black woman. But when you look at the records, she was classified as white. But then when he died, they listed her as his consort, which is kind of unusual. And I know consort can mean wife, but you know, they didn't usually refer to the person as a consort. But this man was the cashier of the Virginia Bank. So he was incredibly prominent, but he worked as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. His name was William Bagnall. And then you had John Minkins, who was working aboard the city of Richmond as a steward. And somehow she connected with them and they dressed her as a man. But before they did that, she said she prayed for heavy rain so that the docks would be cleared. And that, you know, that would be the only thing that I guess would push these night watchmen out of the area of the docks so that she could get aboard the ship. And that's how she made her escape. But we know from the records that a lot of people were hired to monitor those ships and docks. And by 1856, Virginia made what we call Fort Wool today. They made that the inspection station for Hampton Roads, and that's also where the ships from Richmond would come down, and they had to stop there and be inspected before they could leave to go to northern ports. And there were a number of ships that were cited and fined, and some people imprisoned because they refused to stop, with the idea that these individuals were hiding people aboard their ships. So the night watchmen, the night riders, the nascent police force, it was very important to checking people's credentials. If you were free Black and you were out at night, you could be arrested because it was past curfew. If you were an enslaved person, and you know, that's why the adoption of, I call them prison clothes, you know, is a certain type of slave clothing that was worn, and it was adopted throughout the country. They would all have the same kind of clothing. That stood out, like those orange jumpsuits of prisoners. And so people would know they were enslaved, and they would stop them if they did not have a pass. They would throw them into the slave jail. And the slave jail in Richmond, the slave jail in Norfolk, all located near or on Main Street, which is where all the slave traders were located too.
Wow. Oh yes, I think Sherry says thank you. Yeah, that was a great question, Sherry. And I'll take this moment real quick to plug that one of the reasons why I brought Dr. Newby-Alexander here is because over the winter, we are working on an exhibit about freedom seekers in Fauquier, and some of the documents that we found have mentioned the constable of Fauquier County, quote unquote, carrying different slaves with different names from one location, and then it'd say something like 10 miles to the jail. And then there's sometimes information about what they're spending in order to keep that person in jail, specific handcuffs and leg irons and things like that. So a lot of that information will go up in our back jail, in the jail where they most likely would have been kept, sometime over the winter. So we're hoping at least by February or past that. So, okay. And Lee Lawrence says, thank you for mentioning the court records. So important. I wish they were put online and archives open to a wider group of researchers. Could not agree with that more. I know that Fauquier County has an index of deeds, wills, and trusts that is so handy. I'm sorry, Fairfax County has that, but Fauquier County does not. So hopefully someday they'll do that here in Fauquier, but I could not agree with that more. I had one last question, but folks, if you guys need to head out, I totally understand. And thank you so much for coming. But if you want to stick around for this last question, you are welcome to do that. Mine has kind of something specific to do with the jail that I was definitely wondering when Dr. Newby-Alexander was speaking. We found a lot of information about sort of the jail and the jailer in particular, and enslaved people. And particularly, we found that from a period somewhere in 1817, 1818, the jailer here was keeping the enslaved people of slave traders for potentially on the way to be sold wherever they were about to be sold. And so later on, they're very adamant that they inspect the jail to see if he's still doing that. And eventually they come back and find that no, he's not doing it with slave traders anymore, but he is taking the enslaved people of enslavers who they're having some trouble with them, or they're being problematic, and so they're bringing them to the jail for that reason. And at one point, it mentions slaves belonging to the county who are being held in the jail but haven't been registered the way that they're supposed to. And I wondered if that is, do you think that that's possibly related to what you were showing about the condemned prisoners? Do you think that's probably what that means when they say belonging to the county like that?
In some cases, yes. Yes, okay. Definitely. Okay. And I think that we're only now just scratching the surface, because some of these individuals, I'm convinced, tried to escape, and may have tried several times. And if an owner decided that they were incorrigible, that they would, they would be condemned. Right. And of course, condemning them means that you would get compensation as an owner.
Right, right. So there was an incentive to go through the legal process in that way and have them condemned and taken to a prison. So it seems likely to me that that reference is probably referring to enslaved people who had been condemned and were now being kept in the jail until they could eventually be sold. Wow. Also, I want to say that there's a mention of Dr. Horner in there, and he comes up in all the documents we're looking at. He's an inspector of the jail, so it's very interesting to see his name there. The last thing I wanted to ask is, in one of the slave broadsides that you put up, it had Richard H. Foote at the bottom. In fact, one of them is one that we've seen before, but he's mentioned in a bunch of documents in the 1850s, a lot of slave broadsides. So it's clear that he's not the enslaver looking for his enslaved person. He's the person to refer to if you find that enslaved person. So I'm wondering, is there a person that would typically be like running the centralized hunt for an enslaved person within a county? And is that who Richard H. Foote likely is? Or is he a bounty hunter? What do you think of that?
Yeah, it could be any of the above. Okay. A lot of times they are the ones who own the jails that you would take them to, holding cells of some sort. Because I've seen a number of them in our area. They'll talk about William Hall, who owned a slave jail, which is where City Hall is located today. So you'll see these references to these individuals. Sometimes you'll see Lumpkin with Lumpkin's notorious slave jail. And Lumpkin is a whole nother story. There was a man named Robert Emerson who also ran a slave jail in Norfolk and then moved to Richmond and partnered with Lumpkin for a while. Both of them were married to enslaved Black women and sent their children to Pennsylvania to be educated at finishing schools. And Lumpkin, of course, actually married this woman that he had purchased and I'm sure sexually abused, because she was only about 13 when she had his first child. And she became an inheritor to his property. And a similar kind of thing happened with Emerson. So these jailers had some very complicated lives.
It's so crazy. It's crazy that you say that, because we had a slave trader here in Warrenton named Jordan Saunders, who also married what is described in the documents as a mulatto woman, and he has a son with her. And I've read a lot of his letters, and he's awful in all the way that slave traders are, and the way that he talks about Black people and the experience of being enslaved. But he does eventually end up marrying a mulatto woman, and it's such a strange headspace to get into. Yeah.
Psychology of people's behaviors and actions, it's hard for me to wrap my mind around it,
Yes.
except to say that human beings are selfish, evil little buggers, and they will always do what you don't expect.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. Well, with that, we'll end, guys. Thank you everybody so much.
Sean,
Yes, Laura,
can you
please, go
hear
ahead.
me?
I can hear you. Yeah, please go ahead.
This is Laura Kelsey.
Hey, Laura.
Hey, I first want to apologize that I joined the lecture late.
Oh, no.
Sounds like it was very, very, very good. But I did want to comment. You mentioned the Dismal Swamp, and I was there a couple of years ago and went to the museum there and picked up a book about a slave that had escaped through the Dismal Swamp. And I went down to look on my bookshelf to see if I could put my hand on it, but I couldn't quickly. And I wondered if you've read it. It's an amazing, amazing story, because he eventually escapes and learns to read and write, and writes his whole life story about his years of trying to escape in the Dismal Swamp. And so when I find it, I'll try to send you the name of it, in case you haven't read it. You probably have, though.
I haven't, but Dr. Newby-Alexander might have.
Well, I'm wondering, are you talking about Moses Grandy?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. He actually was promised his freedom by different ship's captains, but he
Yes.
operated a smaller steamship that went up and down the canals, and eventually gained his freedom. And he talked about even some of the Maroons who were
Yes.
in the swamp, because many of the enslaved and free blacks who worked the swamp for the lumber company actually co-contracted with the Maroons out there to get whatever quota they needed for the cedar wood, and they traded goods because, of course, the people didn't need money. What they needed were products. And that's where Dan Sayers comes in, because he's looking at some of the products that remained, and that sort of proves that they were in contact with people in the outside with some of the things that they had, that they owned, and that were left in those communities. And of course, just as one more thing to mention, there was a man by the name of Colonel Wild, who went to the Dismal Swamp and raised a regiment of United States colored troops from the people who lived in the swamp. And many of those families, after the Civil War, came out, and some of them are still living in and around the remnants of that part of the swamp that they
Right.
lived.
Well, I just wanted to mention it because it was such a compelling story.
Yeah, it is. In fact, you can find I think a copy online of Moses Grandy's book. It is a heart-wrenching story.
It is.
He
Yes.
talks about his brother, his younger brother, who froze to death because the owner sent him out with almost no clothes in the middle of winter with snow and so forth. And, people were treated horribly, horribly. And when you read these accounts, you know that these individuals carried that hurt and pain of what happened to their families, to their death.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, I'm glad you mentioned, the Virginia side and the North Carolina side. And the North Carolina side actually has the museum. And I encourage people to go to both. You have an entrance from Chesapeake, an entrance from Suffolk, and you have an entrance from off of Route 17 in North Carolina. And to go to these different ones, you see different things. But the more comprehensive story is presented at the North Carolina
Yes.
site.
Yes. I agree. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura. And Laura, no, go ahead.
John.
No, yeah, thank you. And actually, you coming on reminded me, Laura's the president of the Historical Society. So real quick, I will say, if anybody is interested in becoming a member, you can do so online. You can come to the museum. You get free admission for an entire year to the museum. You get 10% off in the gift shop. You can get one free event depending on what tier you do. So a lecture like this, you would get entirely free. So definitely think about doing that, guys, if you're interested. And we're going to keep doing these lectures as long as we can, and even going into the spring and with the vaccines, I have no intention to stop doing virtual because it just makes everything so accessible. We can get amazing speakers, and we can get people from all over the state to come and see this. So definitely keep your eyes out for what's happening next, everybody. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Dr. Newby-Alexander, if you could stay behind, I have a quick question about one of the graphics you had, and then about keeping this recording. But everybody else, thank you so much for coming, guys.
Thank you all so
Bye.
much.
Have a happy holiday. Yeah, I just had a quick question about one of the graphics, and if you could send it to me, because it was really good. And then I wanted to ask if I had your permission to put this recording out on our Facebook. Yeah? Okay, excellent. That was